Any discovery which renders consumption less necessary to the pursuit of living is as much an economic gain as a discovery which improves our skills or production. Production, by which we mean the exact opposite of consumption, namely the creation of valuable things, is only necessary in order to replace the stockpile into which consumption continuously gnaws. Kenneth Boulding, and I hope you're all sitting. This comes from 1945. And yes, we are back within the realm of Radio Tipping Point. My name is Mike Boyle, and our show today is titled Nature is Messy. And my journey to this subject took numerous paths, and one of them was tied to a subject that I allude to quite often here on this show, with our obsession with efficiency. Which very often in multiple respects has been unveiled to be the biggest death knell to anything of quality that we're leaving on this planet, either being ecological or social. And it comes down to some very basic traits that we have as human beings, some more than others. Here I claim guilt with my obsession of getting things done, and how mess simply just gets in the way. But I know I am not alone. I am not alone. And I suspect a number of you out there are afflicted of the same compulsion. Yes, sirree. And there are probably a number of reasons why I can only speak for myself, and I leave that reflection to be something solely within your own domain. So please do not wait for any sign of approval coming from this side. Feel empowered. Make the pledge. Well, from my perspective, it very often is tied to this idea of control, both real and perceived, and that necessity that I have to hold that overview over all those things that are taking place around me, not with the intention of directly participating in all of those events, but I hate being blindsided. All of a sudden something shows up that I was not mentally prepared for, and that is really what we're talking about. And through such mindsets, we feel that messy forces us to lose an oversight. It's messy is clearly not linear. In my particular case, my aversion to that messiness is all tied to cultural baggage that I'm carrying around. And perhaps the most interesting part of this messiness compulsion, or this anti-messiness compulsion, is that this never ends. It's a continuum. It's running all the time. And it becomes a routine, like so many of our routines, that we are not even aware of what we're doing, lest the effect that those routines are actually playing within our micro environment or in a meso or macro environment, that if we look at it from a cumulative. So today I'd like to look at it, not necessarily completely and reflective, but I'd leave that totally to you if you find value, and I suspect you probably could find value in performing some sort of reflection about some of these things that I'm talking about. I'd like to look at maybe some of the causes that lead us to this affliction, and lest we leave the show, especially prior to Christmas, without some sort of goodie, I plan to talk about various ways of where sometimes not too recent past that we did things much different, that very well could be the solution that what we're looking for today, anno 2022. But within the thread of the show, I'd like to impress on you that we all have the power to make a difference here, and so I'm hoping that some of these solutions that I talk about are seen as being somewhat empowering. But let's get started. Enough of my babbling. Well, the first step is very much aligned with our evolution and our relationship to nature. There was a time that it was just the rest of the ecosystem and we were not around, or if we were around in very small numbers. When we think of how the planet looked at one time before we got to work. And back then, if you were to cut down a tree to, say, build a table, the effect wouldn't be that great on the ecosystem, but the benefits or the values for us would be huge, because we would be able to run things more efficiently, or perhaps even, let's say, meaningfully. But then there were more of us who needed more trees, and so we have then less trees, so every tree that we cut becomes much more significant. And when we have an overflow of tables and we don't know what to do with them, then one has to really question the value. But very often we have looked at this ecosystem or nature as being our adversary, because it was just simply getting in the way of us being able to accomplish those things that were considered to be our right. So we've made it our goal to standardize nature, limit the damage, quote unquote, standardize our interactions. Actually, we're standardizing our interactions with nature so that we can foster some sort of predictability that we pretend that we know how nature's going to react, in that we build these structures that more or less keeps nature in line. And that process has led us to where we find ourselves today, and that is in a state of monoculture. Because monoculture is manageable. Monoculture doesn't get in the way. But what we tend to forget is that monocultures do not have a very long lifespan. Western linear perspective, invented in 1413 by Brunelleschi, has influenced art, architecture, and urban design for the last 600 years. Linear perspective's impact on art and architecture is obvious, but its influence on European culture extends way beyond the arts. The rules of systems of linear perspective have also broadly influenced Western science. Quote from Carl Welty. And these thoughts from Carl have been truly a revelation, where I felt, and it's a topic I talk a lot about on these shows. I always make the claim that it started with René Descartes, but actually Descartes was not in the DNA pool, not even close, in 1413. He showed up about 200 years later. Please don't quote me on that. That was putting my finger in the air and trying to measure the wind. But it certainly wasn't 1413. And you can see by such actions that were taking place in us defining our art and our architecture, and we see this within our urban landscape. That was a clear effects, or perhaps it's a continuation perhaps of the others. Probably a continuation when I think about it. That we have been dealing with this affliction for a long time. So I started thinking, what are these better ways? How can we allow for a multiculture or bioculture environment to flourish, knowing full well that that is really the only way for us to move forward? And I was able to come up with 4 different categories of topics I'd like to talk about today. Just checking out the time, and I see that I'll need to put on my running shoes, but these 4 perspectives will be tied to rural, which is an easy one, urban, our interpersonal ties, and then lastly the economy. So first, let's give you a brief description of the 4, and then we'll move on from there. When I'm referring to rural, could go much beyond that. Anything that is directly tied to the non-Anthropocene. And we'll talk about the ways that permaculture actually manage the space that we have in a way that allows for that biodiversity to flourish. Within the urban, I will be relying primarily on thoughts coming from Jane Jacobs, where she directly alludes to, and this was back in the 50s, she alludes to this cleanliness that we were trying to install in the cities as being the main culprit for us reaching a certain state in eliminating virtually all quality of life. And she talks about layers of people on the sidewalk, and I don't refer to individuals laying on the sidewalk, but rather we have different types of groups, identities to be found all together, not necessarily stationary, but they will be trying to perform some sort of tasks, and they're all managing that at the same space. And Jacob's point was that this ensures a continuous life, that because we're all at the same place, the only way that it could really work is to remove this concept of the individual, only my needs, but rather understanding mutual interest, because it's that interdependency that we have as individuals which actually allows for that social biodiversity to take place within the urban environment. And she talks very often about this type of setup allowing for us to establish true safety within our community. And I'll go more into detail on that one later on. One of my favorite, I'm going to call him a philosopher because he has gone into so many different directions, Mark Granovetter, came up with the concept of strong ties versus weak ties, and I'll talk more about why those weak ties are the ones that allow for our social biodiversity to flourish. And then lastly, I'll go back to probably the most famous finance minister we've ever had here in Austria, going back to the First Republic, 1929, Josef Schumpeter. And not only his concept of creative destruction, but he came up with a number of different views that allow for us to understand that there are better economic models out there, and we need to free ourselves from those constraints that were imposed on us primarily after the Second World War. But first, tick-tock, 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 tick-tock. The constraint of time. The more we synchronize ourselves with the time and clocks, the more we fall out of sync with our own bodies and the world around us. Now, this was truly a revelation for me, not really thinking too much about the subject. But this idea of synchronized time is a relatively recent phenomenon. It's not like the cave people woke up and they looked at their clock and they said it was 6:59, we have to start moving, otherwise we'll miss the bus. Time has been, until recent memory, very much aligned with the movement of nature, specifically the movement of the sun. And many actions were determined and triggered by wherever the sun may be, and certainly the strength and the like. But this standardization actually hit full force in the 19th century only. And it's quite interesting that we find a correlation between time standardization and the introduction of the railway. And some of you might be posing the question, how come? And if you think about it long enough, look at it from a personal perspective, that answer is right in front of you. Because if we don't know when the train's showing up, and the train will be going past multiple areas, that the whole system falls apart. So we needed to define what time the train arrives. And I spent some time researching into that transformation that took place in the 19th century, and there were a number of individuals. We're always surprised, or I'm surprised, that there was a fair amount of resistance. And if you look at the rationale, the reasons why they were against this movement, that all looks very prescient. There was one quote I remember reading from a newspaper in Cincinnati sometime. It was relatively late in the 19th century. I want to say between 1870, 1880, around then. And the criticism or the critique that was raised about the deployment of a standardized time was directly related to this subject, that by coming up with this artificial means, as it was seen to be, that it estranges us more from nature. And an open question was posed, so where does this end? Where does it end? But I found one remnant that's still around today, and it's called the Bristol clock. And if you were ever in the city of Bristol in the UK, you will see that there are two clocks on the exchange. One reflecting GMT and the other one reflecting Bristol time. And what I understand is they're roughly about 10 minutes different. And the Bristol local time is apparently 10 minutes behind GMT. Now you might think that, 10 minutes isn't a big deal. Well, if you miss your train, it's a big deal, and I think all of you would agree with me on that. But it's not just 10 minutes. It is that estrangement that is created by us transposing some sort of so-called values that supersede reality that's taking place around us. And I would argue that it's precisely this type of mindset, attitude, approach, edict that has led us to this point that we find ourselves to be right now. going back to the rationale, the reasons why it's so important for us to bring some order into this messy bedroom that nature has created in our neighborhood. That I believe that our fear is really not about nature. I think it's tied to our fear of how we are going to react, and the inability, and this is really where it's taken us up till now, the inability for us to be and do. And when we concentrate on making instead of just doing and being, and the making being our reason to be, it's almost a form of risk management. And I go back to some of the thoughts from Ivan Illich in my postulation of his thoughts. Well, if we are supposed to make, then we have come up with a common definition of what is acceptable. And of course, this is all form of risk management. So maybe the others won't deliver, or maybe I will end up on my own, or maybe I will not be prepared. And there's always the fear that we might shock ourselves with our own behavior. So let's get into the 4 categories, and starting with permaculture. The goal of modern agriculture was to cut out those elements that we cannot control, those elements that we cannot predict, and time plays a very important role here because we don't know how long it will take. So if we can turbocharge certain activities, then that's good. And I think this all falls in line with that of what I said earlier, when there was a lot of nature and not too many people, it didn't make that much of a difference. All in the realm of sustainability, being a steady state where we're trying to keep a balance. If there's plenty of nature and there aren't too many people, then you don't really feel the effect. But there is a tipping point that takes place where the balance is skewed. Well, basically there is no more balance. And we have found that process taking place within the realm of agriculture. This is no secret. This is one that we talk about almost daily. And we know how the power to be found within the agrarian industrial complex being managed primarily from Brussels, but not exclusively. We see plenty of examples here in our illustrious country. But we tend to forget there are other ways to do it that are clearly more effective. Apart from the normal and obvious elements of relying on seasons, not only for that of what can be produced, but making provisions to understand that our sufficiency is more easily realized than than perhaps what might appear at first glance. Let's look at the concept of grazing, where we have our fields, and the idea is to feed certain livestock so that they can perform various activities, including offering themselves for us. But within this mono-centered approach, where we eliminate anything that could possibly get in the way of the grass growing, so that the livestock can have at it, that we have indeed created a situation where we have less and less grass. Don't even talk about the number of livestock. And there is a better way if we understand that there is a relationship between various living things that actually augment themselves, then we are able to achieve a much greater yield within a very small space. Understanding that we can fulfill the needs of various insects, animals, all at the same time, if we were to plan things a little bit better. And nature creates systems that are as effective as the best pesticide out there, more effective than the best fertilizer out there. We just need to just let it be. And what's great here, close to Vienna, we have a number of farmers who are living precisely under this principle. I know because I've visited them. And it's truly amazing what kind of yield they are able to generate on a very small patch of land. Without pesticides, without artificial fertilization or fertilizers. So what's out there? So nobody can say it can't be done. And in fact, all of these people didn't invent something new. They just went back to see how we have been doing things for eternity, for the most part. And I started thinking about this concept of permaculture and to what degree the basic tenets can be transposed onto other areas. And for me, this was truly a revelation after going through the work of Jane Jacobs again, based upon some conversations I've had with some good friends, and postulating the effect of our urban strategies have actually led us to a situation where I believe a number of us are very much disenchanted with the viability of our communities on various levels. That whether this concept of permaculture can be found somewhere else. And I really did find it in reading Jane Jacobs with my permaculture glasses on. I realized that she was talking about the same thing. She was talking about the exact same thing when she talked about having different identity groups or cultures together, that there is a beautiful result that comes out of this interaction. And it's especially for somebody who grew up in an area where mass transit was more or less non-existent. And we built highways, freeways over areas of certain groups within the city so that we could eliminate any possible contact. That one of the things that I really noticed when you live in a city that has a very vibrant public transportation system, that even if that interaction might be fleeting, you have some interaction with individuals who clearly do not belong to your tribe. And of course, we know this leads to all kinds of complaints. That people complain that we don't hear German being spoken in the subway or on the tram. I would argue that before you didn't hear anybody talking, period. This reminds me of a story I heard a number of years ago. This is coming from somebody from the United States who moved here to Vienna from Atlanta, and she just arrived and took public transportation for the first time, and was immediately saddened. Because she saw the faces of all the individuals there in the public transportation, nobody talking, all very dour. And she was wondering who died, because it reminded her of the reaction of those people around her at the time that Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. So I don't know about you, but I prefer life. And that rule also applies to our sidewalk. And this is a subject I know I talk about quite often, that the concept of the cars being the sole inhabitants of streets is even more recent phenomena than the synchronization of time. And if you look at footage going back 100 years ago, maybe a little bit farther back, that you saw that the street was a living organism where people would have conversations in the middle of the street. children would play in the street. Sometimes it was getting out of the way when the horse and buggy showed up. But nobody had the feeling that the street was a property of cars only. And through this progress, quote unquote, we have continued to make our streets wider, and the sidewalks have become smaller, so that if two people are walking side by side on the sidewalk, they can basically hold everybody else back. And don't even let them stop to have a conversation, because that will completely destroy our flow. But could you imagine a scenario where we have different types of groups getting together and performing all kinds of activities, including conversation? No differentiation between older individuals who might be just observing what's going on and looking at that as being a form of entertainment, which it truly is. There's nothing more fascinating than watching human beings. But the ability to perform all kinds of actions within various groups in our society, within various demographics, all taking place. And it reminds me of that description I just gave you in relishing in the ability to, at least if only fleeting, very often unfortunately, some sort of interaction with other tribes within our city, just to remind ourselves that there is something apart from those conditions that we have created for ourselves. Either we have freely created or have been created for us, or perhaps maybe a hybrid. Jane Jacobs goes on to talk about I'm not using her words, I'm performing a mashup, the biophilic sidewalk, where we have all kinds of different tribes and activities going on, all messed up, as nature is. That it's that type of environment that ensures the safety that we clamor for as human beings. And she comes up with numerous examples of where those monocentric creations, urban creations, be it a park, be it a high-rise, be it a gated community, actually have the inverse effect, where we think that we keep all of those unwanted elements outside. Sounds like our approach towards nature, right? We keep those unwanted elements outside. That by doing that, we actually created very unsafe environments. And she goes at length to talk about the violence taking place in New York City in the late 50s. You would think it can be a number of cities, including Vienna, in 2022, which means that we have not learned too much over the last 60 years. Jacob's point is that when you have a mixed group that might not know any of the players, there will be always somebody who will have the courage to say, no, that's not right. But if you're in an empty park and you're accosted, who's going to defend you? And that's really Jane Jacobs' point, that we need to have the biophilic sidewalks that allow for individuals that have not been appointed to fulfill these duties. They took it freely upon themselves to do what they thought was right. And her point, and I think it's very valid, is that this is the best format you can come up with to ensure safety within your community. She also talks about public and private spaces, which I thought was quite interesting for a number of reasons. One, the concept makes perfect sense, that we have this need for interaction, but we also need time for reflection. We have time for privacy. And so within this construct, we need to ensure that both needs are fulfilled. Unfortunately, we've put too much of an emphasis on the private part, which meant that we have eliminated the public part for a number of individuals. It's all tied to structures that you put together. And with that, the results are quite clear. And if there was one thing that was more predominant than anything else during the pandemic, it has to be this one, and it is called loneliness. Yes, loneliness. And one last point from Jacobs, and I'll move on to the other categories. She talks about why we do things in the city. And if you think about yourself, you'll come to the same conclusions, I suspect, that you will not go out to do one thing. What you'll try to do is complete multiple actions at the same time, and they might not necessarily always be premeditated. In other words, they weren't part of your to-do list. And that chance happening has as much value, if you allow it, than that satisfaction of crossing something off your to-do list. So let's say, for example, you go to the market, you need to go to the market, you might need to go to some other shops. And within the completion of those various tasks, you will run across somebody you didn't plan to meet. Perhaps somebody you haven't seen in a while. Then you start up a conversation, and as conversations go, you will ask how people are doing, and they might describe something, and they might even get to the point of describing a problem that they have. And this was not somebody you were planning to meet. But very possibly, that person that you meet by happenstance, just on this biophilic sidewalk, they might have the solution to the problem that's probably been haunting you for a while. So the primary needs and the secondary needs and our social needs and our spiritual needs, they might not all be on that to-do list you have, right? So can we create an environment where it could be a little bit messy? And sometimes it can get a little bit irritating because it didn't always work out the way you want. It wasn't always efficient. But damn if it wasn't really effective in accomplishing things, those needs that we have that don't always fit onto a to-do list. Jane Jacobs' idea is that we create environments that are where there's always something happening, partially tied to the safety aspect, that there's always somebody who's going to be there, or a number of individuals who are not necessarily appointed, i.e. the police, but see it within their civic duty to stand up. In areas that are continuously in motion, show life. And we as human beings are attracted to those areas that show life. So let's hear it for life. And when you create these environments, these urban environments, with these biophilic sidewalks in the places for human beings to reclaim their streets, then that will change those things that are permissible. And I found this quote from Jan Gehl, who's a great urban designer from the 60s and 70s, very prescient. The widespread American practice of allowing cars to turn right on red at intersections is unthinkable in cities that want to invite people to walk and bicycle. So if we look at the construction of our cities, specifically puncto mobility, then we know who has the last word, because it's always, I would say, it's the pedestrians that are the losers. It seems like e-scooters have more precedence than the pedestrians. Some might say about the bicyclists, but the bicyclists are having to fight the cars the whole time, because the cars are the ones that more or less set the rules, and we are reminded that every single day. So, going back to my question earlier, are these things that we can manage ourselves? I would answer yes. Can we define our own community? Can we define how we will gain a yield and make sure that not only we are fed, but everybody else in our community? I think you know the answer, right? Let's move on to the idea of weak versus strong ties. And my friend Mark Granovetter talking about impersonal ties. And very interestingly, this has everything to do with that urban environment that I was describing coming back from Jane Jacobs, where there are a number of people that we have something to do with. Oh, you know, the best example is the one that came up that I kind of created on the fly, of meeting somebody on the street that you don't see that often, describing your problem, and that individual is able to come up with a solution. That would be a very good description of what one consider to be a weak tie. That's somebody that you would probably not share too much personal information with, somebody that you are happy enough to meet and converse with, but wouldn't go out of your way. But Granovetter talks about these types of relationship and the power that they hold in coming up with very robust structures within our society. So the inverse of a weak tie would be a strong tie. Typical would be family, close friends, close associates. And the problem is, if those family members, if those close friends, if those close associates have no idea of how your issue can be solved, well, they're not going to help you. But if we're able to broaden the reach of the groups of people that we're in touch with, then following the adage of community of practice, where you really wouldn't have any association with these people, then all of a sudden you find out that you have something actually very important in common, and that breaks the stereotype that your categorization of these people. And it brings us to a point of where we can accomplish something much more important. And as always, the time is way too quick. I see that we are reaching the end of Tipping Point. Thank you very much for joining. I will be back next week. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk about things that are important, and hope that you all are able to appreciate each other. Thanks.